called entry/entry summary or presentation. It pretty much occurs when you submit all the entry and entry summary documents along with duties. That way you don't wait 10 days to submit the entry summary. Presentation is required for items which are under quota. Sorry, I forgot to tell you that for the entry, it uses customs form 3461. For the entry, we use 3461. When exactly is an entry required? An entry occurs when you provide enough information customs to get a release for your shipment. An entry is done on customs form 3461. The entry usually requires three things: a bill of lading, a packing list, and an invoice. And if you don't have an invoice, then usually a pro forma, which is pretty much a substitute invoice that has the information CBP wants. So what are these three things? Let's go through each one. BOL, also known as bill of lading, is pretty much a receipt that the seller gives to the buyer. It's pretty much a change of ownership. It's a proof of change of ownership. So that way custom knows that the item was sold from one person to the other and the ownership changed from the one person to the other. There are two types of bill of ladings: negotiable and non-negotiable. Negotiable kind of bill of lading is something that you can endorse. So pretty much if you bought something, the bill of lading would be under your name, but then you can kind of temporarily give ownership to someone else, a third person. So those type of bill of lading, they can be endorsed. But these kind of bill of lading, they're usually very rare. The kind you normally see are the non-negotiable ones. The non-negotiable ones are pretty much the receipt that you usually get when you buy something. Also, I guess kind of know that the bill of lading, usually these are for truck shipments. If something's coming in an air, there is probably going to be called an airway bill. It's pretty much the same thing though. The second thing is called the packing list. The packing list is pretty much a list of all the items on a shipment. The third one is the invoice, whether it's a customs invoice or a commercial invoice. An invoice pretty much breaks down the values and the items itself. We're going to be discussing each element of an invoice or what's actually required on an invoice for the whole entry summary. So these three items, they're pretty much required for an entry. If you're missing one of these three items, then most likely your broker, whoever that is, they'll come back to you and ask you to provide one of these documents if you're missing one of these, or all three if you're missing all three. Once you submit your entry, within 10 days, 10 working days, you have to submit the entry summary, which is on 7501. When you submit the entry summary, you have to pay all your duties and meet all the legal requirements. Finally close it out. So there are three types of entries: formal, informal, and special entries. Let's go through each of these types. The first one is formal. To be a formal, a shipment has to be a commercial shipment and have a value of more than $2,500. And also, just a side note, when you have a formal entry, it will require a bond. We'll be talking about bonds at one of the later lectures and go through the types of bonds, how long they last, and all that good information. The second one is the informal entry. Informal entries are commercial shipments that are less about what an entry time is. What do you consider time of entry or entry time? For regular entries, the time of entry is when you get a release from customs, unless you tell customs that the time of entry is supposed to be the time of filing the entry, or if you say the time of entry is arrival of a vessel, as long as the vessel is within port limits with intent to unload. So who can actually file an entry? Can anyone just go to customs or go online and just file an entry? Entry can only be filed by someone who has a right to make entry. And who has a right to make entry? The IOR, also known as the import of record. But who can be the importer of record then? In theory, anyone with a financial interest somehow can become the importer of record. But for the exam purposes, there are three people you need to know that can actually become the importer of record. 1, seller, whoever sold the items. 2, the buyer, whoever bought the items. And pretty much a consignee who has absolutely no financial interest in the shipment, but for some reason you are naming them as a consignee. Can they become the importer of record? No. A nominal consignee cannot become the IOR, no matter what. What if you have multiple shipments coming in and they're all your shipments, or there's one consignee who has one order but his order comes in multiple shipments, can he ask the broker to make just one entry, or does he have to file separate entries for each single shipment that comes to the border? Actually, it is possible to make one entry for multiple shipment loads. So for example, if you have 3 trucks coming in of something and you want to make an entry, there is a way that you can make only one entry rather than 3 entries, but you do have to again meet certain rules and regulations for it to happen. You can make one entry of multiple is part 141.57. Now that we have seen the different kinds of entry, when no entry is required, what the time of entry is, and of course there's always an exception for the time of entry, we'll discuss that as we go though, and whether you can make one entry for multiple shipments or not, let's go on and discuss about the actual documents that you need for an entry. And one of the documents that you actually need for an entry is an invoice. Let's talk about an invoice and what some of the items within the invoice is. Check out part 141.86 to learn more about invoices. An invoice needs to contain the basic information that CBP would need to actually release the items. If you remember correctly, there are 3 things that you need to make an entry. 1, packing list, 2, bill of lading, and 3, an invoice. The reason CBP wants an invoice is because they need to get a certain minimum requirement or certain minimum information in order to make a release and keep the shipments moving. What are some of the things that the invoice needs to have? The first one is the port of entry. The second one is the name and the address of the buyer and the seller. The third thing is whether the buyer is related to the seller or not. The fourth thing is the type of charges which are on the invoice. The reason the type of charges is required to determine how much duty the importer will eventually pay to CBP. So in order to calculate the amount of duty for CBP needs to know what type of charges are on the invoice. It could, for example, have something which CBP doesn't think needs to be dutiable, or something that doesn't have to be dutiable. So if that charge is included on the invoice, CBP needs to know that this charge is included, and the final invoice value doesn't show the actual dutiable charges itself. The 5th item is the currency type. The 6th item is the country of origin. The 7th item is the quantity of item. The 8th item is description of the items. And the last thing is the value. Value is something we'll discuss later on much deeper. When making an entry, there's also a certain number of items where there is no invoice required. To make an entry for certain kind of things, you actually don't need an invoice. An invoice is not required for non-commercial shipments. An invoice is not required for items which were shipped outside the US, were not delivered and then returned to US. The third thing are items which have been exported to the US after being in continuous custody of. The third things are items which have been returned to the US after being in custody in foreign customs within 6 months. The fourth item is when you export something outside the US, it's repaired and then it's returned to the US. The 5th item is if there's a shipment for US government agency, then you don't require an invoice for that. The 6th thing is item which is entered temporarily under bond or permanently under bond for exhibition. The last item where you don't require an invoice is pretty much for merchandise which result from manipulation or manufactured in an FTZ, also known as a foreign trade zone. We'll talk about foreign trade zone later on. But you also have to understand that even though you don't require an invoice for all these items or all these things or in these conditions, you still need to find a way to provide customs with the information that they require. You have to understand that customs still requires all that information that they would have required if these items had required an invoice. So for example, if you import a phone, there are certain elements on an invoice that we discussed which customs requires. Just because you're bringing in a non-commercial shipment doesn't mean that they don't want that statistical information or that information. For example, customs still wants name of entry, name and address of the buyer and seller, and all these things that we discussed are still required by US Customs. Therefore, even though an invoice is not required, you technically have to make a fake invoice, which is also known as the pro forma invoice. In addition to these things, when a customs broker is doing an entry summary